been fleeing your entire life. Why the most powerful version of you lives in the silence you've been training yourself to run away from. Let me ask you a single, very specific question. When was the last time you were completely, comfortably, uncomfortably alone, and your first instinct was not to reach for the phone in your pocket, the remote on the table, or the name of someone you did not particularly want to talk to but could not, even for 30 seconds, bear the silence of your own company without filling? Sit with that question for a few seconds before you answer it, because your answer, more than any of the other answers you have given today, will tell you something honest about the actual shape of your life. Because here is what I have noticed, looking at how human beings behave in the part of the 21st century most of us are now living through. People will do almost anything to avoid being alone with themselves. They will scroll for 4 hours through content they will not remember by tomorrow morning. They will call someone they actively do not like just to keep the line from going quiet. They will turn on a television show they are not watching, the volume set just a little too high to be background, just a little too low to be honest, and they will leave it running for the entire evening. Because they have decided that a room with someone else's voice in it, even a stranger's voice saying things they do not care about, is preferable to a room with only their own voice in it. And I want to ask you the follow-up question, because it is the one no one ever asks. Why does silence feel like something is wrong? Because you have been told your entire life, by your school and your culture and by every romantic comedy that framed the central tragedy of its plot around whether the protagonist was going to be sitting alone at a restaurant at the end of the movie. That being alone means you failed at something. That solitude is the consolation prize assigned to the people who, after the kind of life you were supposed to be having failed to materialize around them, get left behind. That if you are sitting alone at the restaurant on a Tuesday night, alone at a party where everyone else appears to have found one another, alone in your apartment on a Friday for the third weekend in a row, you are somehow less. That is one of the most expensive and most quietly destructive lies ever introduced into the architecture of an ordinary human life. And today we are going to dismantle it, slowly, piece by piece, with evidence drawn from history, from philosophy, from the actual clinical literature on what your brain is doing when no one is talking, and from real stories of real people whose lives were permanently restructured by an unplanned season of inescapable solitude. What I am about to show you is this: the most dangerous, the most powerful, the most genuinely free version of a human being is the one who has become completely comfortable in their own company. Not lonely, not isolated, not broken by the world into the kind of aloneness that arrives as a punishment. Alone deliberately, on purpose, with full ownership of the choice. That is not weakness. That is the rarest single form of strength still available on the planet. And by the end of this video, you are going to want to protect your solitude the way you currently protect your money, your time, your credentials, because you will, by the end, recognize it is worth more than all of them combined. Stay with me. The lie is not just a lie. It is a revenue model. Let's begin by saying something completely honest that almost everyone who has ever written about solitude has been too polite to say out loud. Society does not merely prefer that you stay connected. Society needs you to stay connected, because your discomfort with being alone is one of the largest, most reliably monetizable psychological conditions in the modern economy. Sit with that for a moment. Every app on your phone, every single one, across every category of function, from the social to the productive to the entertainment, was engineered, on purpose, in rooms full of the most expensive behavioral scientists alive on the planet, with one specific stated objective: to make sure that the moment you feel even a flicker of boredom, even a momentary absence of input, your hand reaches for the glass rectangle in your pocket before your eyes have finished registering that the feeling arrived. You open the app. You scroll. You compare yourself to the curated version of someone else's Tuesday. You react. You consume. And the moment you consume, someone, somewhere in a building you have never been inside of, makes a measurable amount of money from the consumption happening on your screen. Your restlessness is someone else's revenue stream. There is a precise term in the behavioral science literature for the mechanism that produces this: variable reward reinforcement. It is the same mechanism that keeps a gambler in front of a slot machine past the point at which they have lost more than they came in with. Sometimes the jackpot hits, sometimes it does not. The unpredictability, not the reward itself, is what produces the compulsive behavior. You are not addicted to your phone. You are addicted to the fear of being without external approval, which is what the phone has been quietly engineered to provide in the smallest, most easily consumable, regularly spaced doses. And here is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the loop did not begin with the smartphone. The smartphone is only the most recent, most efficient, most perfectly financed version of an approval economy that was operating on you long before the first app store opened. It began in childhood, when you raised your hand in the third-grade classroom and waited your whole small body rigid with anticipation to see whether the teacher would say good answer or would simply move on. When you wore a specific shirt on a specific morning in a specific grade because you had been told that shirt was the kind of shirt that got a kid noticed. When you changed the way you laughed in a specific circle, not louder, not softer, but calibrated to whatever frequency that particular group seemed to reward, because it made you, for as long as you were inside the circle, feel less alone. We were trained, from an age we do not consciously remember, to need each other's approval in order to experience our own selves as complete. And a person who needs external approval to feel whole is a person who can be controlled. I do not say that to be harsh. I say it because understanding this particular mechanism is the actual beginning of the freedom you have been told, for years, does not exist. The Stoic philosophers lived in one of the most relentlessly social, most politically dangerous, most externally performative environments ever constructed by human civilization. Ancient Rome. A world in which who you knew determined whether you would eat this month, in which who liked you determined whether you would live through the next political transition, in which who feared you determined whether your family would inherit anything you had spent your adult life accumulating. The Roman world did not have an algorithm to monetize your restlessness. It had something considerably more efficient than an algorithm. It had the Senate. And yet Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, three men operating independently across three radically different life circumstances, arrived at the same conclusion, in the same generation, using the same internal vocabulary. The only freedom that cannot be confiscated by anything external is the freedom you build, deliberately, inside the silence of your own company. Epictetus, who was born into slavery, who was owned by a man with the legal authority to do anything to his body the owner wanted to do, who possessed nothing in the world by any of the usual definitions of possession, wrote that the man who is not master of himself is not free, regardless of whatever his external circumstances happen to be. He had no property. He had no legal rights. He had no political status. He had no social network he could rely on for protection. He had his mind, and he chose with the same deliberateness a blacksmith chooses the iron he is going to work with, to cultivate that mind in solitude, in reflection, in disciplined, repetitive, unbeautiful interior labor until it became the single most influential philosophical instrument in the entire subsequent history of Western thought. He did not need a crowd. He had himself. And on the days when the crowd is the only thing that holds you together, that is a much smaller inheritance than it looks like from the outside. The brain is doing its most expensive work in silence. Here is something that neuroscience and ancient philosophy agree on, which, given how rarely those two disciplines agree on anything, deserves your full attention. Silence is not empty. The neuroscience research of the past 2 decades, well-documented, replicated, peer-reviewed, has produced a finding that the modern world has been quietly ignoring, because the finding would not, if it were widely understood, monetize very well. When the brain is given sustained time without external input, it does not shut down. It activates what neurologists now call the default mode network, a specific, identifiable collection of brain regions that wake up specifically when the brain is not being driven by external tasks. The default mode network is the part of your brain responsible for memory consolidation, emotional integration, the generation of original insight, and most importantly for what we are discussing right now, the construction and maintenance of your actual sense of self. When you are quiet and alone, your brain is doing its most expensive work. But, and this is the part the modern economy has gone to considerable expense to keep most people from understanding, the default mode network cannot fully activate when you are receiving external input. Every time you reach for your phone, every time you check a notification, every time you let someone else's voice enter the space you were just about to inhabit on your own, you are interrupting this process. You are, with full mechanical precision, stopping your brain from thinking its own thoughts. Think about that, and let it land without rushing past it. When is the last time you had a thought that originated entirely inside you, not seeded by something you read, not prompted by something you watched, not shaped by something you heard from someone else, but produced for the first time by your own mind, in the silence of your own company, from your own resources? That is the hidden, consistently underestimated value of solitude. It gives your mind back to you. Nikola Tesla, one of the more original thinkers of the modern era, by any reasonable accounting famously described his method of working as the construction of entire electrical systems in his own head before any of them needed to be built in physical reality. He would sit for long, deliberate, uninterrupted solitary stretches where he spoke to almost no one. He was not antisocial. He was protective of a specific kind of mental real estate, the kind that has to remain empty if the actual original work is going to happen inside it. You do not have to be Tesla. But the principle is the same in your life. Your best ideas, the ones that arrive in the shower, the ones that arrive on a walk you almost did not take, the ones that arrive in the 3 minutes between putting the phone down and falling asleep live underneath all the noise. Silence is the only doorway that leads down to them. The emperor who wrote to himself because no one else was qualified to ask him the hard questions. Let me tell you about a man who held more political, military, and material power than almost any human being in the recorded history of the species, and who chose to spend his private hours completely alone with his own thinking. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, head of the most sophisticated bureaucratic institution the world had ever built. He had advisors. He had generals. He had a wife. He had children. He had a court full of people whose entire professional existence consisted of competing for his attention at every hour of the day and night. And every single morning, before the world could reach him, Marcus sat alone and wrote. Not for anyone else. Not for publication. Not because he expected to be remembered or admired or quoted. Not because he was building a public philosophy that he intended in some future generation to package into a bestseller. He wrote for himself. What he wrote became what we now call the Meditations, arguably the most personal philosophical document ever recovered from any civilization. And the remarkable thing about what he wrote is not the part everyone quotes in books they have not finished reading. The remarkable thing is what he chose to write about. He did not write about his enemies. He did not write about his victories. He did not write about politics or power or the strategic calculus of the wars he was fighting on multiple fronts. He wrote about his own weaknesses, his own frustrations, his own tendency to lose patience with people who had not earned the loss of his patience, his own anxieties about his own death, his own ongoing, unfinished, frequently failing struggle to act with integrity when no one was watching. He was the most powerful man alive, and he used his solitude to hold himself accountable to standards his position could have allowed him to abandon indefinitely without anyone outside his own private conscience noticing. He wrote, in one of the entries that has survived, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This was not performance. No one was ever meant to read this. The journals were never, in his lifetime, published. This was a man completely alone with himself, doing the work that no one around him was qualified to do for him, because no one around him had the unrestricted access to his interior life that he had. And here is what I want you to understand about Marcus Aurelius that almost nobody bothers to teach. His greatness as an emperor was inseparable from his discipline and solitude. Every decision he made in public was shaped by the thinking he had done in private the daily. Unglamorous, unapplauded, unrecorded by anyone, exterior labor of becoming a version of himself that could meet the morning on its own terms. The Stoics had a daily practice they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Every morning, before the day began, they sat alone and asked themselves, what could go wrong today? What difficulty might arrive? Where might I be tested? Where might I fail? Not because they were pessimists, because they were prepared. They had already faced, in the silence, the version of the day that the day might bring. And when the day brought it, they were already at peace with it, because they had been at peace with it since dawn. That is the competitive advantage of solitude, and it is the one advantage that compounds across an entire lifetime. The person who has sat with themselves long enough to know what they actually think, who has faced their own darkness in private, who has rehearsed their own collapse without an audience, that person cannot be rattled by the version of themselves the world sometimes tries to install in the room without their consent. Who are you at 2 a.m.? Here is the question that most people spend their entire lives, taste test lives, comfortable lives, professionally successful lives, family-supported lives, not asking. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who you want to be. Not who you perform as in the rooms that matter to your career or your reputation. Not the curated version of yourself that exists in the eyes of your colleagues, your followers, your family, the people whose opinion is currently determining the shape of the life you are convinced you have to keep arranging yourself around. Who are you at 2 a.m., in the dark, with nowhere to perform and nobody to perform for? Most people are terrified of that question. Not because the answer is necessarily bad, it might, in fact, turn out to be very good. Most people are terrified because they realize when they finally stay with the question long enough to hear what comes back that they do not know the answer. And the reason they do not know is because they have never been still long enough to find out. We build our identities the way we used to build social media profiles. Curated, strategic, audience-aware. We choose the parts of ourselves we suspect other people will validate, and we amplify those. We hide the parts we are mildly ashamed of, not because the parts are actually shameful, but because we have not yet built the tolerance to be seen with them in the room. We adopt opinions, almost automatically, because the opinions make us belong to a group we have decided we want to be inside of. And over time, this carefully curated identity becomes the only identity we know. We forget about the raw, unperformed, originally designed self that is still under there, waiting for the moment the performance becomes optional. Solitude is the process of excavating that self. It is not comfortable. It involves work. It has been compared, by people more patient with themselves than most of us are, to archaeological digging. You go through layers. First, the social personality. Then, the adopted beliefs you have inherited without auditing them. Then, the emotional wounds that shape behavior you cannot currently explain. Then, the childhood patterns that have been operating as the executive code of your adult life until you read them out loud, in private, for the first time. And at some point, if you go deep enough, you find something that is not anyone else's. That is you. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this the single individual, the self that exists independent of the crowd, independent of history, independent of expectation. He believed that the greatest task a human being could set themselves was to become that individual. And he was unambiguous about the only location in which the task could be completed. It could not be done in the company of others. It required solitude. It required the willingness to stand apart not as a permanent exile, but as a deliberate, revocable, periodically renewed withdrawal into the only place where the actual work could be done. Most people are in despair, Kierkegaard wrote. They just don't recognize it. They call it by other names: boredom, anxiety, restlessness, the vague sense that something is missing. What's missing is themselves. And the path back to themselves runs through the very silence they have been quietly, consistently, expensively running from. Approval is a drug, and you have been using it for most of your adult life. Let's be completely unsentimental about the next thing, because this is the part where most conversations about solitude get spiritual and vague, and I would rather be honest with you. Approval is a drug. Neurologically, when another human being validates you, a compliment, a like, a particular look of recognition, your brain releases dopamine through a pathway that is the same pathway activated by sugar, by gambling, and in some measurable configurations, by cocaine. You are not, in any meaningful sense, choosing to crave approval the way you might choose to crave a specific flavor of ice cream. Your brain is chemically rewarding you for receiving it. The reward has been installed by evolution. The reward runs deeper than your adult intentions, and the reward is, by every clinical measure, exploitable. Which means breaking the loop is not primarily a matter of willpower. It is a matter of rewiring. And the only reliable mechanism for rewiring a neurology of dependence is repeated, sustained, non-trivial experience of being okay without the approval. Here is what that looks like practically on an actual Tuesday. You make a decision, a real one, a consequential one, and you tell no one. You do not post about it. You do not ask the group chat for reactions. You do not float it past a friend to see whether they would have made the same call. You make the decision based entirely on your own judgment, and you live with the result entirely on your own terms. That is terrifying for most people. Because what if I am wrong? What if I fail? What if the decision I made without consulting anyone turns out to have been a mistake that someone I could have asked would have caught? Here is the answer. Then you learn from yourself, by yourself. And the wisdom you get from that cycle: decision, action, consequence, reflection, integration, done entirely within your own inner world, without external interference, belongs to you in a way that advice you could have received never will. You cannot outsource your own self-knowledge. The mechanisms that build it require your own hand on the process. Friedrich Nietzsche, controversial, brilliant, consistently misread by people who have only seen his name on a meme, wrote the most consequential single sentence you are likely to read today. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely, often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Owning yourself. That phrase should stop you. How much of you do you currently own? How many of your opinions came from your own thinking, rather than from the room you happened to be sitting in when the opinions formed? How many of your goals are your goals rather than the goals your family quietly expects you to be pursuing by now? How many of your fears were given to you by someone else, by a teacher, by a parent, by an old friend who was afraid of the same thing you are now afraid of, and you never once stopped to ask whether the fear was actually yours to carry? Solitude is the audit. It is the patient, often uncomfortable, occasionally devastating process of looking at every belief, every habit, every identity claim you are currently operating under and asking, calmly, is this mine? Or did I inherit it without realizing I inherited it? What survives that audit that is your actual self? And that self needs no external validation, because it was never built from external validation. It was built from the quiet, unglamorous daily labor of becoming a person who could meet their own mind in silence and not flinch. The Stoics were not monks. They carried their solitude with them into the room. The Stoics were not monks. They were not hermits. They did not preach isolation as a permanent life choice. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. Seneca was a senator and a playwright who staged tragedies for the Roman public. Epictetus ran a philosophy school that produced some of the most consequential thinkers of the following century. They lived in the world actively, fully, with all the noise and all the danger the world contained. But they carried their solitude with them like a room inside themselves that no external event was allowed to enter without an invitation. Seneca called this practice recollectia the gathering inward. He wrote to his friend Lucilius, in a letter that has survived 20 centuries of transmission, "Retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with those who are likely to make a better man of you. Not withdraw from the world, retire into yourself." There is a crucial distinction in those last two sentences, and most modern readers miss it because the modern mind has lost the language for the distinction. Retiring from the world is isolation. Retiring into yourself is sovereignty. The Stoics believed that most human suffering did not arrive from circumstances. It arrived from judgments about circumstances. And judgments, the wrong ones, the reactive ones, the fear-driven ones, the approval-driven ones, are most likely to form in a mind that has never been deliberately trained to do its own thinking without external input. The person who has never sat with themselves has no internal reference point. They do not know what they think because they have never thought without influence. They cannot tell the difference between a thought they originated and a thought that was installed on purpose by a culture that profits from their not knowing the difference by the algorithm they have been quietly obeying for the better part of a decade. The Stoics had a precise vocabulary for this. They called the result they were trying to cultivate epistemonic clear knowing, and they were unambiguous about how clear knowing got built. It required quiet. It required the willingness to step back from the noise and examine your own life with your own eyes, on a regular basis, with no audience, with no applause, with no optimization, with no monetization. Epictetus gave his students a daily exercise he called the observer self-practice. Any moment of difficulty or confusion, you pause, you step back, mentally, not physically, not visibly, just inside the architecture of your attention. And you ask, calmly, in the only room that matters, what is actually happening here? And what is my judgment about what is happening? And are those the same thing? That practice only works in a mind that has been trained by solitude to be still. A mind that is not constantly reacting to the loudest external input is the only mind the practice is going to function in. The Stoic lesson on solitude is, in its full form, this: the strength you develop alone is the only strength that holds in every situation life is likely to throw at you. A reputation built on other people's opinions can be gone overnight. Status built on social connection evaporates the moment the connection changes. Physical strength fades by the year if you stop exercising. Even money, the most persistent external thing the world has produced, can disappear in a single market cycle. But the person who knows themselves, who has forged their values in solitude, who has tested their convictions in private before carrying them into public, who has audited their own inheritance and rejected the parts that turned out not to be theirs, that person has something no external force can take. James, 23, who lost his summer A&D, found his self. I want to tell you a story here. Not of an emperor, not of a philosopher, of an ordinary person. In the summer of 2011, a young man named James, 23 years old, studying finance at a university in London, had what appeared, from the outside, to be everything a young man is supposed to want at 23. He was popular. He was inside the right friend group. He had a path laid out that looked, on paper, exactly like the path everyone around him was on. Finish the degree, join a firm, climb the ladder. His parents were proud. His friends were doing the same thing. The trajectory was so visible and so conventional that no one in his social circle, including James himself, had ever stopped to ask whether the trajectory was actually his. And he was miserable. Not in a way he could explain to anyone. Not in a way that showed on the surface. He laughed at the right moments. He showed up to the parties. He nodded along in lectures in a way that produced the minimum required engagement. But inside there was a quiet voice he kept ignoring, a voice that kept asking, in a tone that was getting harder to dismiss with every passing week. Is this your life, or is this someone else's life you are still performing inside your own body? And then his summer plans fell apart. The internship he had lined up did not come through. His friend group scattered for the season in 4 different directions. His girlfriend, who had, until that point, been the primary architecture of his social calendar, ended the relationship with the kind of finality that does not invite negotiation. And for the first time in his entire adult life, James had weeks of genuine, unstructured, unavoidable solitude. At first, he filled it the only way he knew how, frantically. He had never been able to be alone with himself. He had always needed noise to drown out the silence. He had always needed company, plans, the next thing on the calendar, the next voice on the other end of the phone. So he grabbed at everything the silence offered him that was not, itself, silence, but slowly, without anyone to perform for. Without anyone's expectations pressing on the outside of him like a coat he could not take off, something shifted. He started writing, not for anyone, just to hear what his own thoughts sounded like when they were not being shaped by the room he happened to be sitting in. He discovered, across those weeks, that he did not actually want to work in finance, that he had never wanted to work in finance, that he had wanted to work in finance because it was what serious, successful people did, and he had been building his identity around being a serious, successful person since he was 16. But the actual James, the one underneath all of that, wanted to build things, physical things. He had always loved design, had always found himself staring at architecture, at product design, at the way objects were assembled. He changed his path. His parents were confused. Some of his friends, the ones who had been quietly most invested in him staying on the original track, thought he had lost it. He did not particularly care, because for the first time in his life, the decision had come from him. Today, James runs a small but internationally recognized product design studio. He employs 12 people, and if you ask him, which I have, what the single most consequential professional decision of his life was, he will tell you it was forced on him by accident, by an unplanned summer alone with himself. The solitude did not give him a new career. The solitude gave him back the person the career was going to have to be designed for. The career followed naturally. The way careers almost always follow, once the person they are supposed to belong to has finally been allowed to come back online. Loneliness is pain. Solitude is power. Do not confuse them. Let me take this into the dark now, because this is where most scripts about this subject stop, and that is exactly why most people who start reading them never finish the work they were hoping the reading would do for them. Loneliness, real loneliness, is painful. That is not a philosophical claim. That is a biological one. Humans are social creatures. Our nervous system was not designed for sustained isolation, any more than it was designed for sustained sleep deprivation or sustained nutritional deprivation. Researchers at a major research university documented, with peer-reviewed precision, that social rejection activates the same brain regions as a burn on the skin. The pain is, neurologically, the same kind of pain. So when I tell you throughout this video to embrace solitude, I am not dismissing the pain of loneliness. I am making a distinction that most people, including most of the people who write about this professionally, miss entirely. Loneliness and solitude feel similar on the surface. Both involve being alone. But they are psychologically, structurally, completely different experiences. Loneliness says, in its voice, I am alone, and I do not choose to be. Solitude says, in its voice, I am alone, and I am exactly where I need to be. The shift from one to the other is not about changing your circumstances. It is about changing your relationship with yourself. And that is the uncomfortable part that most people, when they get close to it, turn around. The uncomfortable truth is this. Most people experience loneliness not because they lack other people in their lives, but because they are not good company for themselves. They do not like what they find when they look inward. They do not trust their own judgment. They do not feel comfortable with the person they actually are when the performance is off and the curated version of themselves is not available for deployment. So the fear of loneliness, the actual lived fear that most people are running from every time they reach for the phone, is actually the fear of self-confrontation. And that fear has to be walked through, not around. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who did more than any single person in the 20th century to map the actual interior architecture of the human mind, described something he called the shadow. The parts of ourselves we have rejected, suppressed, hidden, refused to acknowledge, or performed confidence over rather than actually examine. The jealousy we feel towards someone we are supposed to be happy for. The ambitions we are quietly ashamed of because we were taught that ambition, beyond a certain level, was not ladylike or not gentlemanly or not appropriate for someone of our background. The fears we perform confidence over because performing confidence in the rooms we have been trained to perform in gets a better result than admitting the fear. The grief we never processed because the people around us did not have the bandwidth to hold it for us when it needed to be held. The shadow does not disappear because you refuse to look at it. The shadow grows. It leaks into your behavior in ways you cannot explain. It drives decisions you cannot account for. It produces, in the rooms you have been performing in for years, an unexplained quality of unease as if the room has been slowly filling, without your noticing, with something you cannot see but can feel. Solitude is the room where you meet your shadow, where you look at it. I see you. You are part of me. I am not afraid of you. That confrontation is not pleasant, but it is the most transformative single experience available inside an ordinary human life. A person who has faced their own darkness in private cannot be easily frightened by the darkness in the world. A person who has made peace with their own shadow stops projecting it onto others, stops seeing enemies where there are none, stops reacting from wounds they have refused for years to acknowledge. This is why genuinely strong people are more often than not quietly spoken. Not because they have nothing to say, because they have already said everything that needed to be said to themselves in private, in silence, in the actual room where the conversation has to happen before it can happen anywhere else. Priya, 28, who lost 60,000 followers and found herself. Let me tell you another story. This one is closer to now. In the spring of 2018, a woman named Priya, a content creator in her late 20s based in New York, with 380,000 followers on the dominant visual platform of her generation had, by every external metric, built something real. Brand deals, speaking invitations, recognition on the street. A business she had constructed from nothing, on her own, with the kind of relentless discipline that almost anyone watching her from the outside assumed she was enjoying. And she was having a breakdown. She told her therapist, in a session she later described as the first honest minute of her entire adult life, that she could not remember the last time she had eaten a meal without thinking about whether it was postable. She could not walk into a room without instinctively calculating the lighting. She had started to feel, in her own words, like a character I invented, trapped inside a performance I cannot stop. Her therapist gave her a prescription that was, by the standards of the therapeutic industry she was operating inside of, unusual. 30 days. No posting. No consuming anyone else's content. No creating for public consumption. No performing. Just her. The first week was by Priya's own description. When she talked about it later, the most uncomfortable experience of her adult life. The withdrawal was physical. She felt anxiety, restlessness, crawling, specific compulsion to check, to create, to share, to manufacture the next piece of evidence that she was still the person her audience had been applauding for a year. But she had committed to the 30 days. So she sat with it. By the third week, something began to emerge. She was cooking again. Not for the image. Not because the meal would photograph well. Because she genuinely loved the way garlic smelled in olive oil. At 6 in the evening on a Tuesday, she was reading long books, real books, the kind she had not touched in 2 years because there was no metric for having touched them without half of her attention still pinned to the screen of the device that had been quietly running her life. She was walking in her neighborhood and actually seeing it. The architecture, the faces of the people she was passing on the sidewalk, the light as it shifted over the course of an actual day from morning afternoon to evening. She was rediscovering what she actually thought was beautiful separate from, and untethered to, what her audience had previously rewarded. She came back to content creation. Different. She started posting in a way that felt honest rather than optimized, authentically awkward by the standards her audience had been trained to reward. She lost, in the months that followed, about 60,000 followers, roughly 16% of her base. Her engagement rate tripled, but more important than either of those numbers, more durable than either of those numbers. She stopped waking up every morning to the immediate numbing anxiety of whether last night's post had performed. She had found in 30 days of deliberate silence the thing she had been trying for years to share with her audience in the first place: herself. The trap that the modern attention economy has been quietly installing in millions of people is not, ultimately, the phone. The trap is the slow, deliberate replacement of your internal compass with an external one. The trap is the moment you start defining what is good, what is beautiful, what is meaningful, what is worth doing by what other people respond to when you do it. That is the trap. And once you have handed the compass over, you have handed your soul over with it. Solitude gives it back. The practice, not theory. Let me get practical for a moment, because philosophy without application is entertainment, and nobody, including you, came here to be entertained. How do you actually turn time alone into personal power, not this year, not someday, this week? First, create structured solitude, not passive loneliness, not lying on the couch doing nothing and calling it recovery. Intentional, committed, defended time with yourself. This could be a morning ritual of 45 minutes, before anyone or anything else has been allowed access to your mind. No phone, no music, no input. Just you and the room you are in, alone with whatever your own mind produces when you stop trying to outsource the production. The Stoics had a morning practice. Before the day began, they asked themselves 3 questions. What might challenge my values today? How will I respond with integrity when it does? What am I grateful to be able to do today? This is not passive reflection. This is active mental preparation. Done alone, in silence, before the noise of the world begins. Second, use solitude for honest self-assessment, not self-criticism. Self-criticism is just a different version of social pressure turned inward. It produces the same paralysis, with none of the visibility that would have allowed you to recognize the paralysis as something external to you. Honest examination is different. Where am I right now in this life? Is this direction genuinely mine, or did I inherit it without auditing it? What am I avoiding? What am I pretending does not bother me? What would I do if I were certain no one was ever going to judge me for doing it? Write the answers down. Not to share. Not to perform. For you, alone, in the only journal that has ever actually been private. Third, protect your solitude like the resource it is. Because it is, in fact, the most valuable resource you possess. And it is currently being bid away from you every day in 1,000 small transactions you have not been paying close enough attention to notice. Charles Darwin walked alone for 2 hours every day on a path he called his thinking path. No interruptions, no exceptions. The man who wrote On the Origin of Species considered the 2 hours of guaranteed solitude to be the single most productive part of his entire workday. Virginia Woolf wrote that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write the books she was born to write. The first part was about economics. The second part, the room, was not about writing. It was about thinking. You need space that belongs only to you, not just physical space, mental space. Time that is not allocated to responding, reacting, performing, producing, optimizing, monetizing, or generating content for other people to react to. Guard it fiercely. Because here is what happens when you do. Decisions get clearer, not because life gets easier, because you know yourself well enough by now to trust your own response to life. Anxiety decreases. Relationships improve, paradoxically, because you stop needing people to fill a void you had been quietly outsourcing to them and start choosing people, genuinely, for the specific qualities they actually bring. You become less reactive and more intentional. That is personal power. Not dominance over anyone else, authorship over your own life. The progression nobody tells you about. There is a specific progression that happens if you actually commit to this. Not instantly. Not without cost. Across months, sometimes years. It begins with discomfort. Every time you sit alone without reaching for stimulation, without checking the input, without seeking validation from anyone, without manufacturing the next proof of life for an audience that was, until you stopped feeding it, paying attention, there is a period of genuine physical seeming discomfort. The mind does not like it. At first, the mind does not like it at all. It throws up anxious thoughts. It tells you, in the small voice of a habit that has been running the show without oversight for years, that you are missing out, that something is wrong, that you should be doing something, producing something, being more interesting to the version of the world that is currently, actively, passively watching you via the device in your pocket. This is what withdrawal actually feels like. Withdrawal from approval dependency is not metaphorical. It is real. It is uncomfortable. And it is necessary. Then comes something quieter, a kind of settling. The noise in your head begins to organize itself. The panic subsides. The thoughts that were chaotic, that were looping, that were being interrupted every 90 seconds by a notification you could not, somehow, resist begin to find their natural order. This is your mind beginning to trust itself. Then, and this is the moment that consistently changes people who commit to the practice, comes clarity. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of clarity that gets posted on a Monday morning as an aspirational image. A quiet, absolute, almost cellular certainty about who you are and what actually matters to you. I have talked over the years to a number of people who have committed to deliberate, sustained, multi-week or multi-month sections of solitude. Monks, executives, endurance athletes. Artists in the middle of long, isolated projects. They all describe, with different vocabulary, the same internal event. Not enlightenment. Not transcendence. A simple, unshakable sense of being enough, not better than anyone. Not special, not immune to difficulty, not above any of the ordinary human sufferance, just enough, exactly as they are, without anyone needed to confirm it. That is freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, not freedom from difficulty. Freedom from the exhausting, never-ending performance of seeking approval. And with that freedom comes a different kind of engagement with the world. You stop performing connection and start experiencing it. You stop trying to be liked and start being real. You stop building a life that looks good to everyone watching it and start building a life that, when you wake up alone with it tomorrow morning, feels true to you. That is the transformation. And it begins every single time with the willingness to be alone. The solitary figures who changed everything. Every great figure in recorded history who changed something durable, something that survived them, something that is still operating in the world, went through a period of radical aloneness, not as punishment, as preparation. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, 27 years of enforced solitude, stripped of his freedom, his family, his public presence, his political project. His entire ordinary life. And he emerged not broken, not bitter, not diminished. He emerged with a clarity, a moral authority, a kind of groundedness that no comfortable life could have produced in him. He later wrote that the prison years, as horrific as they were, gave him something they could not have taken from him. They gave him himself. Undistractable, unshakable, clear, he said, in language that has been quoted less often than the famous courage is the triumph over fear line it usually gets bundled with. I learned that the brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. That conquest happens in solitude. The crowd cannot do it for you. The applause cannot do it for you. The fear has to be met, on your own terms, in the only room you have ever had full jurisdiction over, which is the interior room of your own attention. Aung San Suu Kyi spent 15 years under house arrest in Burma, alone, and she did not collapse into despair. She read, she meditated, she refined her political philosophy with a depth and a quiet rigor that only comes from sustained, uninterrupted, deep thinking done entirely by yourself. She told a journalist years later that the years of isolation, though unjust, though imposed by people who had no right to impose them, gave her a kind of intellectual and spiritual clarity she could not have achieved any other way. Then, look at Einstein. Socially, genuinely awkward, often described by his contemporaries as emotionally distant, distracted, not fully attending to the rooms he was physically present in. He worked, for months at a time, in isolation on problems he refused to discuss with any colleague until he had exhausted, entirely, his own thinking about them. He called the practice thought experiments, mental journeys undertaken entirely alone, in silence, inside the actual laboratory of his own mind. The theory of special relativity emerged, and this is the historical fact most people do not know, not from collaboration, not from a team, not from a faculty meeting, from a young man alone in a Swiss patent office. With time he had refused to monetize, and silence he had insisted on protecting, and an obstinate, unbreakable refusal to accept the conventional answer. The pattern is consistent. Every field, every era, every culture. The people who left a mark on the world were the people who learned to stand alone. Not because they rejected others. Most of them, when you read their letters, loved others with extraordinary intensity, but because they had a core self that had been built, deliberately, in solitude, and therefore could not be dissolved by any external circumstance. But very few people ask the prior question, to which legacy is the answer. Who is leaving it? A person built from external approval, whose identity is assembled from other people's opinions, whose values were handed down, fully formed, by a tribe that did not have the time or the inclination to consider the possibility that those values might not be the right values for the particular life the person was actually going to be required to live. That person's legacy is, at best, the successful continuation of something someone else started. The ultimate gift of solitude is a different kind of inheritance. Authorship. The ability to be the actual author of your own life, not a character in someone else's story, not a reflection of the crowd's expectations, the actual writer. And authorship requires knowing your own voice. Your voice, not the voice you put on for different audiences, not the polished, optimized, monetization-ready version, not the version trained by years of quiet, systematic approval seeking. Your actual, deep, unperformed voice, the one that tells you what is beautiful and what is not, the one that knows when something is wrong, even when everyone in the room around you is insisting it is right, the one that gets quietly certain when a decision is right and gets quietly loud when a decision is wrong, before anyone else in the room has reached the same conclusion by a different route. That voice only speaks clearly in silence. There is a moment that arrives, eventually, in any serious practice of solitude, when you realize something that initially feels absurd, and then, the longer you hold it, becomes the most obvious truth you have ever encountered. You were never incomplete. The longing you have been chasing, the approval you have been seeking, the belonging you have been searching for in rooms full of people who were themselves searching for the same thing, none of it was ever filling a void. There was no void. There was only the unfamiliarity with your own self, making it feel like something was missing, when the missing thing you was there the entire time. Waiting in the silence. Waiting for you to get quiet enough, patient enough, willing enough to actually hear it. The invitation. We have covered a great deal of ground today. We talked about the lie society has been quietly telling you about what aloneness means. We looked at how that lie serves systems that profit from your disconnection from your own self. We explored what silence is actually, clinically doing inside your brain. We looked at what solitude has historically done to the people who committed to it. We met Marcus Aurelius, emperor of the known world, who governed an empire from a place of inner stillness that no external event was allowed to penetrate. We met James, 23, in London, who lost a summer, found his own mind, changed the entire architecture of his adult life in a single, unplanned season of solitude. We met Priya, 28, in New York, who stepped off a platform that had been quietly replacing her soul with a performance, lost 60,000 followers, tripled her engagement with reality, and found herself inside the silence of her own company again. We walked through Marcus Aurelius writing in his journal for a private audience of one. We examined Kierkegaard's single individual. We looked at how the Stoics turned solitude into philosophy that has survived 2,000 years of human noise. We understood the difference between loneliness, which is pain, and solitude, which is power. We looked at what it means, in practice, to face your own shadow rather than project it onto the people around you. And we arrived, eventually, at this. You, as you are in the silence alone in the only room anyone has ever had full jurisdiction over, which is the interior room of your own attention, are more than enough. Not as a consolation, as a fact. The silence is not empty. It is the most full place you will ever enter. It holds your real thoughts, your real desires, your real voice, your real self waiting patiently, with extraordinary loyalty, for you to stop running from it long enough to actually hear what it has been trying to say. The world will always be loud. There will always be another distraction, another opinion, another invitation to define yourself through someone else's eyes, even if the someone else is a curated, monetized, machine-optimized version of an actual person. But you now carry something the world does not want you to have. You know that the person who has sat with themselves truly sat in honest, uncomfortable, sometimes devastatingly beautiful silence is a person who cannot be rattled, cannot be manipulated, cannot be hollowed out by disapproval, and cannot be hollowed out in the opposite direction by the praise they have also learned they no longer need in order to get up in the morning. Because they know who they are, and that knowing the only kind of power that has ever in all of human history produced anything worth leaving behind is now yours. So here is your invitation. Not to isolate, not to reject the world, to go home to yourself, to sit in the silence tonight, tomorrow morning, whenever you can carve out the space from the life that has been quietly filling every minute of it for years. And instead of filling the silence, listen. Listen to what has been waiting. You may not like every single thing you hear in the first few sessions. Some of what you hear is going to be uncomfortable. Some of it has been waiting a long time to be heard and is going to arrive, at first, as a kind of grief for the years you did not let it. But keep listening, because underneath the fear, underneath the noise, underneath every version of yourself you have built over the years for an audience you were always going to disappoint, and that was always going to disappoint you right back there, is something honest and strong and entirely yours. And it has been waiting for you. The silence is not your enemy. It is where your power lives.